And I think my sense is we were able to connect the internet without having an oversight regulatory authority in any individual company overseeing this. We ought to let that play out and see what it looks like as we go through the process of replacing those 251 interconnections which exist today and replacing them with IP to IP interconnection.
What we are advocating for is that there continue to be a 251 regulatory backstop. So we're not advocating for the FCC to hop in and determine the puts and takes of a particular interconnection agreement, but what we are looking for is a regulatory backstop that requires incumbents to negotiate IP interconnection agreements and have reasonable terms and conditions.
The universe that those rules were created for just doesn't exist anymore. And so I think, as Bob said, whatever it looks like, it's going to look different than the old world, and whatever that new world is going to look like needs to recognize the fact that it's an environment that's not dominated by one monopoly service provider, but it's actually a number of fairly equivalently sized in terms of overall market shares. I think real-time video communications will be a primary means of communication in the not too distant future. What are the interconnection rules for that going to be? And clearly the dominant players there are not Bob's company or my company, they're Microsoft and Apple.
We're not certain that trials are needed. We don't like how they're proposed now by AT&T. We're worried about the disruption caused by their original proposal. I understand I'm hearing some other things, so that might be fine. From the first panel today, I think one of the gentlemen shared, here are some issues I've identified with the problem transitioning from TDM to IP. I would rather we identified what are those exact issues. I don't think there's that level of specificity yet. And then you have testing around that.
The network was the service, and it was all the same thing. And what's going on at the state level is the realization that as we separate the actual application of voice from the network infrastructure, there's a real struggle as to what the state role is. I think the state role should be focused on consumer protection, but I don't know that Skype would argue or accept the fact that somehow every state in the United States and every state in every country across the world is suddenly going to have a regulatory role over the provision of Skype services.
We think the Act is technology neutral. People are talking about, our first panel talked about here's what's happening with the IP transition. Here are the things that are happening. I didn't hear anything, those were technical things. I didn't hear anything in there that required a change in the regulatory structure we're all living under. So for Christy's point, when she said nothing's changed, that's correct. That's how we see it. The Act is technology neutral. 251 still covers this. There's nothing really changed here.
So instead of having to have interconnection agreements in 22 states, all you have to do is go to Bob's company and say, hey, we want to negotiate an interconnection agreement. It's one agreement. You sit down, you figure out where you're going to interconnect, how you're going to do it, and work it out. So it's a very different environment than the old circuit switched world. And I think we have some breathing room here to figure out how to do it right. We've got the circuit switched interconnections still in place that are getting the job done for today, but they're not going to get the job done for HD voice. They're not going to get the job done for video. And so let's figure out a new model of interconnection that's going to work in that space.
And we're supportive of that. We don't disagree that we need a new model. But where do you go when negotiations fail? What happens? I mean, and I think we view this as more of a less urban versus rural. It's more of a large versus small situation. I mean, carriers of like size have an incentive to interconnect with one another. Where you run into a problem is when you have a big guy trying to negotiate with a small guy. The small guy doesn't have a lot of power. And so the concern here is we're not saying at the outset it's going to fail. We're not saying that. We're just saying if it does, where do we go? I'm not trying to send my voice traffic to your internet via a peer, via a peering partner. I'm trying to interconnect with you in the same manner that I do today to send the same type of traffic, granted in a different electronic format to you, to terminate to the same end user. I don't want to send it over the internet. That's not going to work for me. We're not sitting up here opposing the IP transition. I mean, we think that competition drove the IP transition, And so we support updating the competition rules so that in the transition you don't kill competition, the very thing that drove it in the first place. So we're ready for IP interconnection. We're ready to negotiate. And all we're saying here is that in the future, if we fail or if there is a market failure with respect to IP interconnection negotiations, we'd like to have somewhere to go to talk about it and not have the solution be, go talk to him.